Welcome back, and in today's video, we're going to talk about why central banks should not exist in my opinion. Or maybe they should, but you'll see. Now let's get right into it. Now first, let's talk about what a central bank is. A central bank is a government-affiliated financial institution responsible for managing a country's monetary policy and issuing currency. It typically serves as the regulator of the banking sector and acts as a lender of last resort to support the stability of the financial system. The central bank's objectives can vary, but often include maintaining price stability, promoting economic growth, and ensuring financial stability. Now, the purpose of this video or article, however you're reading or watching this, is to examine the goals and objectives of central banks and present an argument for why they are not only failing in their role, but that their role is no longer really necessary. Now, I may be mistaken, but I will attempt to present this argument in a fair and truthful way, hoping that it will be debated and considered among those who read it or watch it. I will also primarily focus on the Federal Reserve as it holds the status of the world reserve currency and has the greatest influence. Although other central banks may have slight differences, their main functions and capabilities remain similar to the Federal Reserve. Now let's get into it and see what problems we can identify within the central banking system and the Federal Reserve more specifically. Now, my first issue with central banking is that central bankers are not elected, at least within the United States. The members of the Federal Reserve Committee, also known as the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. They serve for a term of 14 years and can be reappointed for additional terms. The Federal Reserve Board is composed of 7 members, including a chairman and vice chairman, who are appointed to 4-year terms. The remaining 5 members serve staggered terms of 14 years. This structure is intended to ensure stability and continuity in the Fed's monetary policy decisions. Now, once confirmed by the Senate, the members of the Federal Reserve Board serve as the top policymakers of the central bank and have substantial influence over the nation's monetary policy, banking regulations, and the stability of the financial system. Now, the problem I see with this is in a world where politicians are flawed and driven by short-term objectives to get reelected, this process can be dangerous in finding the best individuals for this job. While a general election may merely prove to be a contest of popularity, with most Americans unaware of the central bank's dual mandate, there must be another democratic means of selection to the best individuals to control the world's most important price, the cost of capital. And another problem that builds off of that one is that the decisions made by central banks can have a significant impact on the economy, for better or for worse, and it's usually the latter. The decisions made by the central banks have far-reaching impacts on the economies and the lives of their citizens. While inflation is often attributed to the most irresponsible spending of the president and Congress, it is often perpetrated by central bankers who are immune from the same level of scrutiny as the president or key political leaders. This is problematic as most Americans are unaware of who Jerome Powell even is. By the way, he's the current Federal Reserve chairman, but yet he, along with other committee members, can significantly impact the amount that you pay for mortgages, cars, credit cards, and can shift labor markets and equity prices drastically. Now, given the great amount of power and influence central banks hold, it is crucial that there is an increased accountability and attention focused on the actions of not only the Federal Reserve, but also central banks worldwide. And another issue that I see with central banking is that they control the money supply. Now, depending on who you ask, this can be awesome or this can be the worst thing in the world. So let's dive in on this subject and see where we can land, hopefully near the truth. Now, the topic of money supply has been in the news more and more over the past few years, at least in the US, as inflation has reared its ugly head again. The way that central banks go about increasing or decreasing the money supply is in 4 main ways usually. The first way is through open market operations. That is where central banks can purchase government securities and other assets from banks, which increase the bank's reserves and allow them to lend more money, thus increasing the money supply, or just the money that's out there in the economy being spent and within house values. The second is reserve requirements. Central banks can lower the reserve requirements for banks, which allows them to hold less money in reserve and lend more money out, increasing the money supply. A third way is discount window lending, where central banks can provide emergency loans to banks through the discount window to increase their reserves and encourage lending. The fourth main way is forward guidance. Central banks can signal their future intentions to the market through forward guidance, which can encourage borrowing and spending and therefore increase the money supply. Now, the reason all of that is important is this can lead to either inflation or deflation. Now, this graph here shows the M2 money stock, which has increased by over 700% in the past 60 years. You may think, okay, I know what inflation is, I know that there's more money over time, but what does that really mean? So, what it means for economies and citizens who choose to save their hard-earned money in savings accounts. Well, when central banks increase the money supply, the purchasing power of the currency held by banks, businesses, citizens, and other sovereign nations decreases as the supply increases. Another way to think about this is that inflation transfers value from the currency holders mentioned previously to the hands of central banks and large institutional banks that issue debt from the monetary expansion. This also plays a key role in our nation's debt, whereas we have around 32 trillion, and if the government or the central bank can print money decreasing the value of $1, then that $32 trillion is decreased in real value, even though the money is just going back out there into the economy, which can then be taxed to pay off that debt at a decreasing rate. Now, that's really complicated, but basically, they're taking money from you and me and other people who hold bonds and currency and giving it to themselves. This is another example of how inflation has affected the US in the past 72 years, where the value of a dollar has been inflated away by over 1,114%. Now, a huge misconception in the world of monetary policy and general economics that I see a lot of people arguing on and bickering on, and one of the main reasons for the rise of big socialist movements within America is that monetary policy can also contribute to economic equality, but not in the way that most people think. So diving into that, whether you choose to call it inflation or theft, the reality is that inflation causes asset prices such as equities and real estate to rise, and those who do not yet own these assets are disproportionately left behind, leading to a growing wealth gap over time. Another way that inflation, and in particular the Federal Reserve, contributes to inequality is by increasing prices of assets, goods, and services, while wages lag behind. Over time, this contributes to larger wealth gaps. Many Republicans and people who lean towards the right tend to say, well, okay, these wealth gaps are just you being jealous and not providing anything to society, and that the wealth inequality isn't truly a problem of the system. And people on the left will say that socialism could be the answer, and that people need to be taxed more at higher rates, and it needs to be more widely distributed, and there needs to be a higher standard of living for the bottom 10, 20, 30%. And there's a lot of animosity coming from that side towards the rich as well. Now, personally, I think both of those thoughts lack all nuance and are just wrong. And the reason I think that that's not the right way to think about it is that because many attribute wealth gaps to the shortcomings of capitalism, which is ironic because although capitalism can create wealth gaps, it is in fact the debasement of our currency by the government that is one of the biggest contributors to ongoing inequality in our economic system. And I would say it's the biggest. Now, it's true, capitalism is relatively cutthroat because capitalism's goal is not to move money from the many to the few, as many think, but rather it's to move capital from the incapable to the most capable in order to raise the standard of living and prevent shortages and surpluses. And I think if you examine history long enough, you'll know that that is truly the best solution that we have to these systems. Now, another big problem that many have, as well as myself, with central banks is the conflict of interest. And I think it shows how close the central banks are tied to commercial banks. After the great financial crisis in 2008, it became clear that our banking institutions would never be the same again. If you believe in the idea of creative destruction and its beneficial role in capitalism, then the government's refusal to let the large banks fail and instead propping them up for decades to come is the quintessential example of government intervention and market manipulation. At the time, there may have seemed to be no way out of this situation without causing insane contagion that could have torn apart the whole world. But the alternative, which we have today, is a highly profitable and government-backed private banking system in which banks can print profits and crank up risk as far as regulation will allow, with absolutely no risk to themselves, as they have the Federal Reserve to just bail them out afterwards. The choice by the government not to let the banks fail may have been the best way to survive the crisis, but it still leaves us with a banking system that disregards some of the basic principles of creative destruction and the long-term benefits it provides to consumers. Building off of this idea of conflict of interest and close ties between central banks and big, large institutional banks within America is this video right here.
The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon. I'm excited to be here with each of you. Before I get started on my questions, Mr. Moynihan, I wanted to let you know, Saruthi, raise your hand, Saruthi. She has been my team member for a couple of years now, but on Monday, she becomes a Bank of America team member, about which she is very, very excited. So I hope you'll take good care of her and know and recognize the talent that she has shown already in our office. I'm sure she'll do the same at Bank of America.
We will do that, and her father already works for us, so he'll take care of it.
You should have called us.
Well, good. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to chat about some of these issues today. What I'm really interested in is the state of the economy.
How are you floating your resume to big banks? I mean, you're supposed to be the ones, policing the big banks. I mean,
Grow up, Jamie.
there must be some kind of law against working for a financial institution right after you've been working in financial regulation, right?
No.
Her father already works for us, so he'll take care of it.
You should have called us.
Now, I mentioned earlier that the Federal Reserve and banks are incredibly intertwined, and in this video, it is just one great example of how this plays out. The video shows a meeting between the House Financial Services Committee, which is tasked with oversight over the U.S. banks, and one member of the committee references how their colleague, whom is currently presiding over the legislation and regulation of these banks, will soon be an executive at one of the banks. Now, I think you can put two and two together. It seems as though Congress members are presiding and doing regulation over these banks, and then if the banks happen to like them, they offer them a huge payday to then come and work for them. And I think there's a perfect quote that George Carlin once said, "It's one big club and you and I are not in it." Conflict of interest within our government and its banks is clearly present, not by this count alone, but also by the preferential treatment they routinely receive. And it's just one example of how toxic our current relationship with money and debt is. The fifth problem that I see is limited transparency. This section refers to the limited transparency as more of the lack of public knowledge of their role within our government and less about the availability of information regarding their actions. So for those of you who grew up within the US, I'd ask you to try and remember a time where you learned about the Federal Reserve and the history of our monetary policy, and maybe when we got off the gold standard, or when we even got on the gold standard, and Bretton Woods, and all of these agreements that had huge impacts on our economies and our lives. Personally, I don't know anyone who remembers any time throughout their 12 years of government education covering anything about basic monetary policy or anything relating to these topics. Although it's easy to speculate and think that the government purposefully doesn't want us to know how these systems work in order to keep the status quo, I think it's important to remember Napoleon Bonaparte's quote of, "Never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence," especially when dealing with the government where there is plentiful amounts of the latter. Going off of this idea of lack of transparency, central banks operate behind closed doors. When the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell steps in front of the press after a committee meeting and says that because of the data they're seeing with the economy, and they have chosen to raise rates to destroy demand, which can be translated to make your life more expensive so you can't buy as much. Now, it raises the question of what kind of conversations are happening behind these closed doors in these meetings. And central banks are more opaque than other institutions like Congress because while Congress has to pass laws and take votes that are extremely public, central banks carry out actions all throughout the day and carry little to no scrutiny on the mainstream level. Now, that kind of process can lead to suspicions of corruption and manipulation. When the Federal Reserve was first established in 1913, it was meant to be an entity separate from the federal government, which was supposed to make them immune to political pressures. Since then, many things have changed, and it has shown multiple times that the dream of an isolated central bank without the dirt of political influence was just that, a dream. A prime example of this point is in Ben Bernanke's book. He outlines a time when former President Lyndon B. Johnson said, "Martin, my boys are dying in Vietnam, and you won't print the money I need," to the then Fed chairman at his Texas ranch after the central bank chose to raise the Fed funds rate by 0.5 point. There are other stories as well, where the political desires of the current administration impact the monetary policy in order to achieve their specific agenda. This can be good or bad depending on which side of the aisle you sit on. But I think we can all agree that in a day with so much technology, we can determine a better monetary policy than a handful of people sitting in a room pondering backward-looking data in order to determine an accurate cost of capital. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to sum up the main points. In my eyes, there are three main problems that exist within our current central banking system. One, the debasement of currency via inflation. Two, the rising wealth inequalities perpetuated by monetary policy. And three, the skewed incentives of central bankers that are under undue influence from politicians. I believe these issues are an existential problem in our society that, if not handled properly, has the potential to set the US down a path of exponential increases of political and class division because of wealth gaps primarily, and a stark drop in the standard of living, and eventually the implosion of capital markets. Now, that all sounds really grim, and I don't want to sit here and just complain about everything that I see wrong and offer no solutions. So I believe it's important to call out what you see to be wrong or unethical within our systems. However, I think it's even more important that you have those willing to create and advocate for the alternative system or invention that solves these problems. That being said, I believe Bitcoin could be a great alternative that can solve many of these problems above. First of all, it cannot be debased above its 21 million coin hard cap. Secondly, systemic wealth inequalities driven by debasement are impossible as long as there is no fractional reserve banking built to leverage or distort an actual amount, i.e. paper Bitcoin. My proposed solution to the third problem is the removal of interest rate and monetary supply ability of the Fed. Although I realize that's akin to removing a sprinter's arms and legs, I believe these two capabilities is what are corrupted the most, and if we were to develop another cost of capital that was determined by large private banks, that it would be more accurate information signal from lenders to borrowers, enabling us to avoid large misprices when it comes to interest rates. Now, a quick disclaimer for you guys. This is by no means the end-all be-all that can solve all of our problems. This is simply the biggest problems that I see with our current financial system and what I believe can help solve it. This is meant to start the conversation and get people thinking about some of these problems and what is the real root cause of them. And I may be wrong, and I hope you can call me out on that if you think I am. Please leave it in the comments section down below, tweet at me, do something, call me out. I hope you found this information useful and can now see why so many people are so passionate about these subjects, because they have the potential to solve huge systemic issues that are poisoning our society and capital markets. So with that, thank you for watching this video, and have a good day. I'll see you in the next one.